Hi, are you wanting to learn all about ASP.NET 6 MVC? Join me and I'll show you how to build an ASP.NET 6 MVC application complete with authentication, dependency injection, and entity framework. Also, check out the description below so that you can download the code that we used in this video so that you can follow along. Be sure to leave your comments and questions and I'll answer them as quickly as possible. Let's get started. All right, let's talk quickly about the application that you're going to be developing in this course. It's called Garage Sale, and it's really cool because nobody's ever thought of selling their old junk on the internet, so this is going to be a great idea. I think we're going to do well with it. This is the Garage Sale home screen, and here you can see a bunch of items that are listed for sale. If we click on one of the items, you can see more details about the item, more complete description, as well as a price, and who is selling this item. All right. Now, if I want to sell something, I'll have to create an account and log in. So let's click on the seller login and let's log in as Fred. And here I can see the items that Fred has for sale. And I can edit these items, make changes to the description and save. I can delete items and I can create new items. All right. There's also complete account control here as well. I can update my profile, my password. I can recover a lost password and log out, of course. And new users can even register with the Garage Sales service. This is what we're going to be building. So let's jump in. Hey, what are you going to need to participate with me during this course? Well, you're going to need Visual Studio, some flavor of Visual Studio 2022. You can find that at visualstudio.com. Scroll down a little bit where it says Visual Studio and click down. The Community Edition is free. When the installer launches, you'll see the option to install ASP.NET and Web Development Workload. You can install other workloads out of the installer if you wish. Once the product is installed, we're going to create a new project. To select a new project, in the filter boxes across the top, we want to pick C#, all platforms, and then web in the upper right corner. We can scroll down just a little bit in the project templates and you'll see the ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. Hit Next and give your project a name. We want to name our project Garage Sale. You can also choose a location of where you want that project to be installed if you wish. So you can click on the little ... and change that to another location. And on the next screen, you can choose what version of .NET you want to use. This project is for .NET 6, which is the current version at the time that we made this video. For authentication type, we're going to leave that as none. We're going to talk about authentication a bit later. You can configure for HTTPS if you wish. What that does is it installs a developer certificate in your OS so that you can browse to HTTPS URLs for our project. The next two options are if you want to publish to a Linux platform, you can specify a Docker OS to publish that to. You can go ahead and hit create. Once you hit create, it's going to churn for a couple of seconds while it creates your project. After a few seconds, you should see Visual Studio appear something like this. To run the application, we can run it either as a standalone or under IIS Express, or you can run it under a Windows Linux service, the WSL. You can also choose which browser you want, and you can enable or disable script client-side debugging. So let's give it a run, and it's got a home page, and it looks okay. Okay, let's create a mock-up of the various web pages that make up this application. So right now, our application has this, the built-in web page, and we're going to convert it over to this, plus all of the other pages that we have. So on the first one, we're going to add the Garage Sale heading. We're going to add the seller hyperlink, and we're going to put this table of items for sale. So let's get started with that, starting with index.cshtml. It's a file that already exists. We're going to get rid of the code that was already there, keep the div, and we're going to add the heading for the garage sale. We're going to add the link for our seller, And we're going to put a table with a couple of rows in it to show the items that are for sale. So let me close the table and close the div that we have real quick, and we'll take a look at this and see how we did. All right. So if we right-click on the CSHTML and choose View in Browser, it will build the application. It'll give us a preview. It's a lot faster than running it in debug. So that looks okay. Each one of our items was listed in a hyperlink. So we're going to now follow those hyperlinks into the detail page. So you'll notice that we're indicating the action that we want to go to is called detail. We're passing in the ID of the item we want to look at. And of course, these are fake. So let's jump over to homecontroller.cs and let's create a method called detail that will take the ID and show us the detail. Again, this is just going to be a mockup. So we're just going to return view. That means there needs to be a view called detail in the home folder under views. So if I right click on the method name, I can choose add view. I do need to change the name of it to detail. And hit add, and there's our empty view window. I'm going to put in the view data, the title, that's what appears in the title bar. And we're going to put a heading for item detail, a horizontal rule. And I'm also going to put a container. I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to look at my lousy typing. And so nested within that container, we'll create a row to contain the seller's information, the seller's name, a hyperlink to point to the seller's email address, and the time, the date and time that that item was listed on our site. Now I'm going to create an empty row just to create a little spacing here, and then we'll put another row to hold the description header, and then we will put the space for the description itself, which will be a different row. And I'm just going to paste in a bunch of text just as a placeholder so we can see what this is going to look like when we execute it. All right, so I'll format this so it looks nice. Let's go ahead and add some more stuff. You'll notice that there's a hyperlink at the top of our homepage that goes to a different controller, a controller called Seller. So we need to create that controller. We'll add that to our existing project, and we're going to name the controller Seller Controller, or name the class Seller Controller. All right, so here we are with our empty class. It already has an index, which is nice. We are going to use that. We just need to create a view now to go with that. So I right click, choose add view. It's already named index. You'll notice that it placed it in the new folder called Seller. And we're going to click on our seller login, and it takes us to the blank page. So at least it's not an error. Now let's add some content to our seller page. We'll give it a title to show up in the title bar of the browser. And I'm going to put some heading information here, Joe Camel and so forth. Let's build and refresh the browser and see what that looks like. And that looks okay. So far, so good. Now let's add a table to hold the items that that person is selling. So I'm going to put the heading up, close my div, and close the table and close the div, and then refresh it. Okay, the heading looks pretty good. Now let's go ahead and add a couple of fake rows with some stuff on it. I'm going to speed that way up so you don't have to see me typing. So plop those couple of items in there. So that looks okay. We've got an item listed. Let's just paste another fake item in there and build and take a look at it. I do have an extra TR. I'll get that out later. We'll also add a hyperlink for add new. So once this builds, the browser refreshes. You can see that we've got our items listed along with the add new. Now there's 3 hyperlinks on that page: edit, delete, and add new. So let's go to our seller controller and add action methods for each one of those. Add new, no parameters because we're creating a new item. And we'll just go to the edit screen. For the edit and the delete, we need to pass in the ID of the item that's being edited or deleted. And in each case, we'll just return back to the appropriate page. All right, so now build, and the browser should refresh. You can go click on any of our hyperlinks now and see that it tries to take us to the edit CSHTML, which doesn't exist. So I'm going to right click on edit so that we create a view that's named edit. Let me type that in real quick. We're going to call it edit, and it should automatically put it in the seller folder. If it didn't, I'll move it to the right place. All right, so now we have our blank. I'm just going to put a heading on it so that we can identify it. And let's go click on one of these hyperlinks and see what happens. I'll go to the edit button, and there we go. Now let's go ahead and put some real content in here. So I'll put a title. I'll change the title of the page over to item editor. And then we're going to create a form. This form is going to submit to an action. I'll explain these ASP action attributes in a minute. We want this form to be posted, and I'm just going to paste in the fields for the amount and the description and a submit button so that the user can save it. All right, so save this, build, and wait a second for the browser to refresh, and I should be able to click on item editor. When I click on the save, however, I do get an error because we don't have a method for save item. So let's jump over to our controller, seller controller, and add another action method for save item. We're going to return back to the home page or the index, and the new item will show up when we have our system working. So let's take a look at it again. Wait for the browser to refresh. We'll scroll down to the bottom, hit save, and it takes us back to index. So we've got some mock screens and we have navigation all set up, and it's looking good. Let's move on to our next step. All right, let's talk about models. Wait, what? No, not those kind of models. So we did our views and we've got everything flowing, and we don't really have any intelligence in our controllers, but we'll get there. Before we get into the controllers, though, we need to create our models. Model classes or model objects, instances of those classes, are very, very simple objects. They're really just supposed to hold data. They don't typically contain a lot of functionality. We will be adding validators to those models, however, so that will be part of it. The classes that we call models as part of Model View Controller, however, are different from the models that you might think of in object modeling or object-oriented design. Those are different things, and we will probably have classes that are somewhat different than our model classes that represent business objects. Model classes in this context are designed to just hold the data required to populate a screen before we present it to the user, and to hold the data that the user submits back to our system when they submit it. So let's start with that home screen, which we called index.cshtml. It's in the home folder. And take a look at what it's displaying. We're showing a list of items, and for each one of the items that we're displaying, we have a description and a price. And the hyperlink will need some type of ID. So there's 3 pieces of information required to create that home screen: description, price, and ID. The second part to this, however, is that there's a list of those. And from our mock-up, we also had a page number and what page we're currently on. So we're going to show like 20 items at a time. So the model needs to also contain the current page number, how many pages there are, as well as the list of detailed items for that page. Let's design the model for that. So under the models folder, let's right-click and choose Add, and then we're going to choose Class. And I'm going to name the class Listings model. And we're not really going to use a class, however. We're going to use the new C# type specifier known as record. If you don't know about records, take a look at the video that's linked above here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is change this from class to record. And I'm going to first define the listing summary, the object that just holds the ID, the title, and the price. So I'm going to call that listing summary, and here are the fields: int ID, capital ID, and string title. I'm just doing this so they look like properties, and a float for price, close parentheses, and a semicolon. And so that takes care of the individual row in that table. Next, we need a model that represents all of the data on the entire page. So that's going to be a collection of these things, as well as the current page number and how many total pages there are. I'm going to put this definition in the same file. So we're going to call this the listings model. And the fields that we'll be defining are the current page number. So what page are we on? How many pages are there, total pages, and we need to have a collection of these objects that are right above. So I'm going to create an IEnumerable of listing summary and call that listings. So now we have the model object that makes up that landing page, the items for sale. Okay, so now let's integrate that model into the home controller so that we can leverage that on that landing page. So let's open that home controller class up. For now, for the moment, we're still going to be creating dummy data. So we're just going to create objects and pass them into the views and then update the views so that they will leverage the model objects. In the next phase, the next step, we'll go through and make those contain actual data, but we got a few things to do first. So we need to create one of our listing model objects. I'm just going to call that model and equals new listings model. And the parameters are the page 2, so that way we have both a next and a back button. And we'll say that there's 4 pages total. And then we need to create the IEnumerable. Go ahead and put a semicolon out here to finish that up. And I'll create the new list of listing summaries. And here we have an ID and a title and a price. And I'll just create a couple of these. I'll just copy and paste, change the data up a little bit. 2, 3, sample 2, sample 3, and fix the prices so they're all different. So now we have a IEnumerable with 3 items in it, and that's a property in our listings model. We need to pass that model into the view. Okay, there are 2 model objects that we automatically can use. One's called view data. You've seen us use that with the title. The layout page is referencing the view data title property to display whatever goes in the title bar of the browser. There's also a model object called view bag. It's a dynamic property object. We inherit those from controller, and both of those models are automatically visible to the view. When our model is relatively simple, and especially when it's only for output to initialize the web page and we're not using it to gather data from the end user, the dynamic models that are automatically available, we also call them the untyped models. Those are typically okay. Strongly typed models, which is what we just created, have a little bit more capability. Obviously, we can write some code. We could create constructors and conversion operators to help us move data to and from a business layer, for instance. We also have the ability to annotate those model objects with validation rules as well. Again, that's more for the data that the user's submitting to us. We'll see a sample of that in a second. The strongly typed model that we just created is not automatically visible to the view. We have to pass it in when we create the view. So the inherited method called view is overloaded several different ways. Remember, if we don't specify the view's name is calculated or derived from the method name as well as the controller name to determine the folder and the name of the view that we're supposed to be using. One of the overloads allows us to keep that default name, but also pass in a model object. Okay, to integrate it with our view, let's open our view page. So that's under Views, Home. This is index.cshtml that we're looking at. And we're just going to replace the hard-coded stuff with the model properties. First of all, we need to declare our model type so that Razor knows what the data type of our model is. That is typically declared on the first line of our page, and it is declared with the @ lowercase model, and then the data type of our model. And our model is called listings model. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is within the body of this table, we need to loop. Okay, so we're going to use a for each to loop through the model's items property. So for each item in, and the way I reference my model is with capital M model. That's the name of the property that holds our model object. And it is strongly typed. So when I hit the dot, I do get some help on what the name is. So listings. So we're going to loop through our listings and look at each item. Notice that Razor knows what type of object we have. It is a listing summary type of object. For each one of those, we need to have, so let me put the curly braces around this first table row. And so the first thing is the ASP route ID. That is going to instead be item.id. The @ is used to interrupt HTML content and replace the @ expression with whatever values there. So inside the quotes, we'll end up with whatever @item.id contains. The second part is where we have the description or the title, and we're going to replace that. Again, @ say right to the page, item.title. Okay, so next I'm going to output the price. So @ item.price. And I want this to be formatted nicely. Price is a float, and float has a overloaded toString method that lets me pass in the format specifier that I want to use. C will give me a localized currency, so we can get rid of the other dummy item that we had, so we can delete that. And now we'll have dynamic output. What we want to do next while we're here is create an element on the web page that shows the previous, the current, and the next page. After our table, I'm going to define a div that will hold that. So div. And for this, I'm going to use the column class. I don't want to create the hyperlinks for previous and next unless there actually is a previous or next. So we're going to need to test to see what page we're on. I need to now put some Razor logic in here. So an if statement. If the model page is greater than 1, then we will display the previous button. Again, always a good idea to put curly braces anytime we're doing a Razor expression. Forgot the 1 there. I said it, but didn't put it in. Sometimes that happens. Okay, and then we'll put our hyperlink, our A tag. So we'll just hit the hyperlink page. That'll be the page number parameter to that hyperlink. And we'll call that previous page. And that's the end of our hyperlink, static text page, and then dynamic model page of. So now back to static literal text with the of, and we'll output model.total pages. And now we can put the other if statement. That logic would be if the model page is less than the total number of pages, then we can display the next hyperlink and next page. So I think we are almost ready. We just need a close curly brace. All right, so let's do a right click and view in browser. And it should compile in a fairly short order. There's our data, there's our table, there's our previous page and our next page. And if I hover over those, I can see that the page number parameter in the query string is being set correctly. Notice that when I look at the detail URL for each one of those, that it's also encoding in the ID part of the URL. the correct ID for that item. So when we click on detail, it should take us to the right item on the detail page. So let's work on that next. All right, let's take a look at the view page for this. We have the seller's name, the seller's email. Those need to be part of the model. The listing date, that needs to be part of the model. We need to show the title of the item as well. We didn't have that in the mock-up, as well as the description. So all of these things and the price, that needs to be part of the model. So let's go create a model. I'm going to add this to the same file. So I'm going to define my record here, public record, listing detail this time. And I'm going to describe the ID, the listing date, the seller email, the title, the description, and the price. All right, so that's our listing detail. We'll use that to support the detail page. So let's head back over to the home controller, find the detail controller method, and we're going to create our model object, this time a listing detail, and we'll specify all of the items that are required. So that's the simple listing detail. It doesn't have to match anything. And again, we're going to pass that in to the inherited view method. Let's go fix the detail view page. Now we just need to declare our model type. So we'll do that on line number 1 of the view, lowercase @ model, and then the name of the class. So for the seller's email, we will put mail to, and we'll replace that with @bigmodel.email. We will replace the hard-coded seller name with @model.seller. We will replace the date with @model listing date to short date string. We didn't do the title from before, so let's go ahead and put the title in this div. And then we'll replace all of this hard-coded description with @model.description. And then finally, we'll replace the price with a formatted price. And let's see how it looks. So I'm going to do a build real quick, and then we'll pop up that web page. All right, and so there's our page. You know, it looks okay. It's what we were looking for. You can pretty that up a little bit more if you wish, but that's a good start. So we are definitely binding our model and building the view from that model. Let's take a look at the source code behind this. So let's increase the font here a little bit so we can look at this. So most of this at the beginning is all out of the layout.cshtml. So a little bit further down is where we actually see our page being injected. So that's where we have our item detail, horizontal rule. There's the A tag. Notice that we're not specifying any of these ASP things. None of those carry through. We don't have any ASP-anythings. It all turns into plain HTML. All right, let's move away from hard coding model data and create a business service. As you saw earlier in one of our diagrams, the web application is architecturally sitting on top of a business service. This business service could be implemented as microservices, RESTful services, web services, or it could simply be in a different library, a different DLL. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to create the business service layer in the same project. So let's start by creating a new folder in our Garage Sale project. We're just going to create a folder, and we're going to name the folder Business Service. Let's add to this folder a new interface. So we're going to go to add, and we can choose class to make it simple. Name the class I Garage Sale Service. And we're going to change the name, or we're going to change the definition from class to interface. Observing the principles of interface segregation and dependency inversion, we're going to design this interface with our client. In a good object-oriented design, the client or the caller always designs the interface. We want our controller actions to be as straightforward and simple as possible. So the controller actions are going to specify exactly what they want from the business service. So let's start with our home controller. Number one, we're going to declare this service as an instance variable in our class. So we're going to define it as a private, and it can certainly be read-only. And I'm simply going to name the variable service, or SVC. Now I do need to specify the namespace. I can use the little light bulb to do that, to add our using statement. Let's start with index. The first thing we're doing in index is we're creating our listing model, and look at the parameters. The parameters are what the current page number is, how many pages are there, and then the list of items that make up that page. We're going to need a method that we can determine how many pages are there. So we'll define that in the service first. So I'll declare a variable of type int called pages. I will set it equal to the service dot get listings count. If we want to have 20 items per page, then I'll divide whatever we get for our result by 20. Of course, Visual Studio is going to complain that that method doesn't exist, but the tools understand interface segregation and dependency inversion. They give us the option to generate that method. And you can see a preview of the method. It's an integer return type. So that looks okay. I'm going to tell it to go ahead and generate that method. Next, we need a method to retrieve the 20 items for whatever page we're currently on. We're just going to pretend we're on page 1 for this part of the implementation. So I'm going to create my items using var, and I'm going to call the service.getListings for page, and I'll pass in page 1. Now, once again, we see that we have the option under the light bulb to create the method, but you'll notice that it's returning an object, and that's because we used var to declare our variable, and so it doesn't know what that's supposed to be. So let's redefine that real quick. We know it's supposed to be a list of listing summaries. Now, with a strongly typed variable, when I choose the light bulb, it has a better return type than it had before. So now we can refactor our listings model and pass in the values that we got from the service. To display the detail, we have the ID, it's being passed in, so we just need to have the item detail. We already have a record defined for that, so we just need to retrieve it. So let's use our code that we already have, and we'll just call the service.getListingDetail. And we'll pass in the ID of the item that we're looking for. Now, again, I've got a var for the return type, so it's going to generate an object return type. And for now, we'll stick with that. We'll adjust that when we look at the interface and we tweak that a little bit later. So let's just add the generate method. Now let's look at the seller controller and see what methods we prefer to have there. First, we need to create the private variable for our business service. For the seller pages, we have to assume that our user has logged in. So we're going to already know the user ID. Now, we haven't installed authentication yet, so for now, we're going to hard code the user email address. I need to know the user profile, and we'll define what fields are in that user profile in just a second. So I'm just going to declare a variable called user. I'm going to call my services getUser method and pass in the email address of the user we're looking for. And again, I'm going to let the light bulb help me. Okay, so we generated the method. It has an object return type. I'm going to jump over to the interface and tweak that a little bit. So I'm going to right-click on Get User and choose Go to Definition. I'm going to define this as a tuple. If you want to know more about tuples, take a look at my video on tuples by clicking on the card that's going to appear at the top of this video. So the tuple is just a type definition on the fly. ID is the first field. The second field will be the username, the user's name. And then finally, the email address of our user, which is, of course, what we passed in. Now that I've defined that, let's jump back over to the seller controller. So the next thing I need to know are what are all the listings that belong to this particular user. So again, I'm going to define a variable to hold the result. I'm going to call my services get user listings, and we're going to pass in the user's ID. So notice how we knew what that tuple value was based on what it returned. So let's generate this method. Okay, so let's tweak the return type. We expect an IEnumerable of listing summary as a return type. Okay, so back to our controller. So now we can fill in our seller model. I'm going to replace it with our seller name, which is user.name, and then the user's email, and then our listings. The model gets passed in. So you'll notice we have a syntax error here that listings is the wrong type. In our record, it is defined as a list and not an IEnumerable. The best thing to do is just fix that. So let's just go to the definition. It really should have been an IEnumerable to begin with. Not a problem. I can just simply change this to an IEnumerable. Let's move on to the edit part. We need to pass in a listing detail object. So we need just to design a method that will return that. So let's call our service.get, where we pass in the ID of the object that we're looking for, the ID of the listing. Once again, of course, that method does not exist, so we're going to have to create it. And it's going to give us an object return type. That's no problem. We can fix that. We know that it's a listing detail. Okay, now while we're here, let's go ahead and design the business support layer for our other methods as well. For instance, delete. We can call the service method delete item and pass in the item ID. Once again, we can just generate that method. And now we can also save the item. What is actually being passed in when we do the save item? I have to go back and look at our view. This form is bound to a listing detail. So we want to set the parameter to our seller controller rather than just the ID. We need all of the fields. So I'm going to change the definition here to listing detail. ASP.NET will automatically create an instance of the listing detail record and assign to each one of the properties the field that's in the request that has the same name. Since we used ASP4 bindings in the view, those are all going to match because that's how they were defined to begin with. We also specified validation for those fields. The validator executes before our method gets called, but this action method gets called regardless of whether or not the validation succeeded or failed. I definitely want to check to make sure that we have valid data first before I do anything else. And the field that contains that information is called model state. In fact, I'm going to reverse the logic here and say that if it's not valid, I'm going to send the user back to the same edit page with the same model so that they can fix whatever errors they had. So if we get past this step, we know we can send the item to the service to be saved. So let's design that method. I'm just going to call it save listing. And we're going to pass in the item that needs to be saved. Use the light bulb to generate that method. It is generating something with a void return type that takes the item for a parameter. That looks good to me. We'll accept that. For our method add new, we just need to create a model object. So I'm going to create my model and create a new listing detail and -1 for the ID. That'll be our flag to let us know that this is a new item. The date of the listing will be today. Next is the user. Next is that user's email. Next is the title, which will just make an empty string. Next is the description, which will make just an empty string. And finally, the price will be 0. And we'll pass that into our view. And of course, the save button sends us to the save item. So that'll also be part of the design of that save method, is it has to be smart enough to know the difference between saving an existing item and creating a new one. As we were going through the design, you may have realized that get listing and get listing detail are really the same function. So I'm going to update the detail action in our home controller so that it just calls get listing. So I can delete this method get listing detail. That was our one loose end because it had the object return type. So let's take a look at our API real quick, what we've designed. We have get listings count, which returns an integer. We have get listings page, where you pass in the page number that you're looking for. Let's change that variable so that it is more meaningful. And it returns the listings for that page. We have get user, which returns a tuple. The user's email address is what's passed in to find that user. Get user listing takes the listing ID. I think it would be best if we were a little more explicit since everything has an ID. Same thing with get listing. And the only thing I want to do now that I see it is get user listing is returning a bunch of listings. I want to rename this method. So I'm going to use the refactor rename to change the name to get user listings. And that should update it everywhere. Now your code will build. Obviously, it's not going to run any longer because we're not creating an instance of any class that implements this interface. We will deal with that in the next section. All right, let's go ahead and create a service class and wire it into our application as we push our way towards the back. Our first implementation is just going to be a mock service. We're just going to put a lot of that same hard-coded stuff in the class, but we're going to replace all that with actual functionality in just a moment. So to start with, why create the mock service? Well, it helps us to facilitate testing and it gives us functional capability to continue developing our web application. It's very possible that the service layer of our application is still under design and may not yet be implemented, so we can continue on with our website development. To start with, let's create a new class in our business service folder. So I'm going to go to add class and then name the class mock garage sale service. Now we're going to implement the iGarage sale service interface for our class and use the little light bulb to implement the interface. That's just going to create a bunch of not implemented methods. Now let's go through and provide some implementation for each one of these methods. We don't need to do anything for the void methods, but for get listing, for instance, we'll just return our new listing detail containing some dummy information. So fill all this in, put several lines for the description so it's interesting. Got a lot of stuff here to put in and copy and paste some lines if you wish. Now for listings count, we can just return some hard-coded number, say 5, 50, whatever you want to do. Get listings page, we need to return a list of listing summaries. It really doesn't matter what we return here. We'll just create a few listing summaries. So we have something, oops, I messed up here, new listing summary, and then take out that keyword. Okay, and a little formatting, looks good. For the next method, get user, we just need to return a user object or tuple based on our return type. So we'll return something here, add the email address, and that looks good. Now returning the user's listings. And finally, save listing doesn't need to return anything. So that provides us with a simple implementation. In ASP.NET, one of the cool new features is Dependency Injection, and it's built into the ASP.NET service. We just need to register our injected interface and the implementation class in program.cs. When registering an implementation, we can choose a scope, and those scopes are transient, where a new object is created with each request, a singleton, where a new object is created on the first request, and then that same object is used from then on. It's like a global though, so keep that in mind. And then scoped, and in a web application, scoped means one object per request at most. So the first request for the object, it's created. After that, the same object is used, but at the end of the request, the object is discarded. So in program.cs, we're going to use the builder services collection to add a scoped service. The first generic parameter is the interface type. The second generic parameter is the implementation type. So let's go do that. In program.cs, before you build the services, just add an add scoped with iGarage Cell Service and our mock garage cell service class. Add the using statement using the little light bulb so that the errors go away, and we're all set. We just need to modify our controller so that the object is injected. So we just need to create a parameter to our controller's constructor. The framework will automatically pass in the dependency. We need to store that in an instance variable so that our actions can reference it. There's another option here where you can have your controller actions require dependencies as parameters as well. You'll need to mark those with from services. Since our controller actions almost all use the dependent object, we're just going to inject it into the constructor and store it in an instance variable. We already have our instance variable in home controller. We just need to pass in the parameter and set our instance variable from that parameter. All right, and in the seller controller, we don't have a constructor, so let's create one. Seller controller and pass in our service that was suggested to us. So tab, and we're all done. Now let's run it and see what happens. Make sure everything works and looks okay. It's got our items in it. Let's check the seller functionality. Go to edit, hit save. Everything seems to be working okay. And that is our mock object now wired up for dependency injection. Now let's move on to authentication. Hey everyone, did you miss me in the last section? This section, we're going to talk about authentication and authorization. In particular, we're going to implement the identity framework for ASP.NET. Now, you don't have to use identity. You can always just use the built-in authentication and authorization that's part of .NET. Identity comes with a whole bunch of software that's already written to handle the login screen, which you can customize, password recovery, brute force attacks, third-party authentication through Google, Microsoft, Facebook, etc. So it's got a lot of stuff there for free. So we're going to implement that. Let's dive into it right now. First thing we're going to do is right-click on our project and choose the option Add Scaffolded Item. On this screen, choose Identity category and then Identity component. Click Add. After a couple of moments, the identity dialog will pop up. The first thing we want to do is change our layout page. So go to Views, Shared, and choose the layout_layout.cshtml. This just tells it where to insert its components. Up next, out of all of these different UI components, these are already compiled and included in the identity DLLs. But if you wish, you can have source code generated for all of these, and then you can modify the source code to personalize your screens. We won't be doing that in this course. For the next two items, I'm going to take the default for the data context, and I'm going to take the default for Garage Cell User. These two classes will be generated, and we're going to modify those. Then simply click on Add. After a few moments of churning, hopefully we will see results. Now, sometimes you might get an error when you do this part. If you get an error, just try it again. If you're still getting an error, try going back and adding some of the components that it might be complaining or missing, or start with a brand new blank ASP.NET project and add identity to that, and then you can simply copy over the components. Quick rundown of what was provided. First of all, you'll notice an areas folder was added with identity as a subfolder. There's the data folder with the two classes that we generated. We're going to come back to those in a second, as well as a pages folder with some CSHTML, some Razor pages here. If we had overridden some of the other pages, those would show up here as well. You can always go back to that wizard and run it again to get components, source pages if you want those. One of the other changes that was made was in program.cs. So let's take a look at what happened here. First of all, we have our database context was added. That class was generated. It also created a default identity on Garage Sale User, which we need to add a using statement for that. And it added that entity framework store for that. So 2 services were added. Remember, services are part of the dependency injection framework. We're going to take advantage of that here in a bit. As far as the pipeline, the HTTP pipeline, you'll see that we have use authentication was added, as well as use authorization. Right. One other thing that you'll notice is in your views shared folder, there is a partial called login partial. We're going to add that to our layout page so that the user has the option of logging in. So let's open the layout.cshtml. And right after the menu bar's unordered list, we're going to add a partial. To specify that. Let's take a look at it and see what it looks like when we run it. So you'll notice that added the register and login options in the upper right-hand corner. Perfect. All right, now let's try clicking on register or login, and you'll notice nothing happens. And that's because the routes are not mapped. So we need to run back over to program.cs real quick. So what we need to do is add routing for the Razor pages. So that's going to be app.useEndpoints, and then use the endpoints parameter to map Razor pages. Okay, and that's all we have to do. Let's try it again and see if we get through to the register and login pages. Much better. Next, we're going to make the seller controller require authentication. So open up your seller controller class, and at the very top, right before the class, we're going to add the attribute authorize. And use your light bulb to add the correct using statement for that. You will also notice in our garage sale application, if we try to go to the seller page, that we're redirected to the login page, and you can see the return URL is set to take us back to the seller page. This is because we have the authorize attribute on our seller controller. All right, it's time to finish this thing off. Now we're going to implement our business object model and a real business service that uses a database. All right, so now for our object model. So far, it's pretty simple. We have a user, a seller, that can log in and list items. So we could say that a seller has many items. So let's start off by creating the item class. So let's drill down to areas, identity, data, and let's create a new class called item. All right, and our class item will have an ID. We're also going to have the user that owns this item. Next, the item has a listing date, the item has a title, and the item has a description. And finally, the item has a price. Now, this class is going to be used to generate a database schema. So I'm going to provide a couple of hints to Entity Framework so that it knows that, for instance, title is not a varchar maximum. Attribute that I'm going to use is called max length. And we're going to set the max length to say 255, whatever length we think is good. And I'll use the little light bulb to add the correct using. So we'll set the range from 1 to 10,000 as the maximum value of what we can sell here on our garage sale. Let's create a couple of constructors to make this class easy to use. I'm going to first have a 0 argument constructor that is required by Entity Framework. I'm also going to create a constructor that lets us parameterize most of the items, attributes, or properties. All right, that should be our item class. All right, now let's take a look at Garage Sale User. This was generated by Identity, and you can see that it inherits from Identity User. And they tell us, hey, go ahead and add application-specific properties to this class. You're welcome from Identity. So for our Garage Sale User, I would like to add a property to store the person's full name. And finally, I want to create a list of items to hold the items that this user owns. We'll again mark this as virtual for lazy loading in Entity Framework. Now the items property will maintain through the functionality of the application, but the full name property I would like for identity to prompt the user for that and make that part of the identity screens. First, I want to make full name required. I also want to say that it is personal data. Identity allows the user, gives the user a link to delete all of their personal data from our database, and a max length for this as well of, say, 60. Required and max length are in the component namespace, so I just need to use the light bulb to add that using. Okay, next let's go look at the context class. So what we want to do here is add a list of items. All right, so we'll define our simple property DB set called items so that we can query all of the items in the database to display on that home screen. In the business service folder, let's create the garage sale DB service. So we're going to add a new class, and we're going to name the class garage sale service DB for database. This class, of course, is going to implement the interface that we specified. And we can use the little light bulb to generate stub methods for us. Additionally, every method in this class is going to need to have a database context. So next, I want to create a private variable to hold the database context. I'm also going to create a constructor that takes a garage sale context as a parameter, and we'll use that parameter to set our instance variable. This will be supplied for us by the dependency injection framework. So speaking of dependency injection framework, let's head over to program.cs and change the definition. And because the database context is already registered with the dependency injection service, it knows how to pass it into the constructor for our context. So that's pretty nice. All right, so let's go ahead and implement our business service class. We have our database context, so that gives us access to all of the link methods that we need to use. Let's do a couple of quick things here. I'm going to create a property called user email. Okay, and I also need to have a method to know who the current user is, because we're going to do everything in terms of the currently authenticated user. So let's create another property of type garage sale user called current user. Add your using statement if you need to. We're only going to have a get method. This is a read-only property. So I'm going to get rid of that stuff. And we're going to return ctx.users.single, selecting an object whose email address matches the user email property. Okay, now let's implement the delete item. The first thing we have to do is find the item that we want to remove. So I'll use the current user. Since we made changes to the context, we need to save those. Get listing, we pass in a listing ID and it returns a listing detail type of object. So we have to find that item and then we'll create the listing detail. And get listings count, pretty straightforward. Get listings page, we need to work on this a little bit because we're hard coding the 20. We'll make that a parameter at some point. To show you some variety, we can use a link query here. When we create a query like this, it doesn't actually execute until we do some terminal operation on it. So I'm going to skip to our page number -1 times 20, and then take 20 items and then convert that to a list, an in-memory list. Okay, now we're going to have to make a change to how our tuple here is defined because the user ID that's used in identity is not an int, it's a string. So we're going to have to modify that. That means we're going to have to modify it also in the interface and also in our mock. Now, notice that we were passing in the user ID to get user listings. We don't need to do that anymore. We know who the current user is, so we can just get rid of that parameter. We'll go update the interface and the mock with that in just a second. Okay, so now we just need to return the current user's items, but not as item objects, as listing item record objects, an IEnumerable of those, but we can do that easy. Link has a good way to do that. We're going to use the current user items collection, but we're going to use the select method. The select method lets us do a transform. So each item that's in the items collection, we're going to change that into a new listing summary. This is called a projection in Entity Framework. And we'll just to-list this. Last but not least, save listing. Now, if you'll remember that this same method is used for creating new items as well as updating existing items. So the first thing I want to do is create an item and then determine, I want to change the name of this parameter to model to avoid confusion with our item that we're going to create or update. So I'm going to declare my item object, and we're going to check and see what the model ID is. If the model ID is less than 1, then we need to create a new item and add that to the current user's items. Otherwise, we need to find that item, and then we'll just update all the fields and save changes. All right, so remember we moved the parameter from get user listings because we already know who the user is. So we just need to change the interface, get user listings, eliminate that argument. We'll need to do the same thing with the mock service as well. Now we need to fix up our controller because we've had a couple of places where we're passing in different things. So get user listings, for instance, needs to be empty. And we're going to do one other thing with our seller controller, and we'll need to promote that user email property to make that part of the interface as well. So let's refactoring and say we want to pull that up to the interface. We'll need to also update our mock service. We can just create a dummy method here because we're not using it for anything. We'll just make it an auto property. Since in the mock service it's not even used, we'll just make it a dummy property. Now we're going to do one more thing in configuring the database in addition to the use SQL Server connection string. And you can find that connection string, by the way, in the settings, app settings.json. There's our database connection string. So you can change that to something else. We're going to add one more thing here. So I need to use curly braces because we're going to have multiple statements. We're going to say use lazy loading proxies. Now, it's not going to find that method. It's an extension method that we do not have defined, and you don't even get the light bulb for that. So in order to resolve that, we need to go to NuGet and bring in another object. So on your dependencies, your project dependencies, let's right-click. Let's go to Manage NuGet Packages. Under the Browse tab, just type in proxies. And one of the options should be Microsoft Entity Framework Core Proxies. Let's install that, accept the terms and conditions, and we're done with that. All right, for our next step, we're going to create the migration code and update the database. Migration code is Entity Framework generated classes that will create or update a schema as we make evolutionary changes. We don't have any schema or any database right now, so the first class will be the initial creating class. In the Package Manager console, we're going to use the command add migration, add-migration, and the name of the class comes next, initial create. You'll see that a folder called migration was added, and there's a couple of classes in there. So let's take a look at the initial create class that was generated for us. And you can see that it's creating tables based on what identity requires, as well as the item table that we added to that data context. In the Package Manager console, I need to use the update database command. The update database is going to look at our data context, execute these creation classes, and generate the tables that are required. Now we know that identity already has a screen where the user can register. And now that we've added the full name property, full name will be on that registration screen, as well as the profile settings. We'll take a look at that in a second. I also want to create a couple of users initially. We're going to write some throwaway code here that's going to just seed the database with a couple of users and some items for those users to sell. So we're going to head over to the home controller, and we're going to create an additional action method here called seedDB. In order for our seedDB to create users within the identity framework, they need to go through some code that identity sets up for us. One of them is called the user manager. So let's declare a parameter to our seed database called user manager. The user manager is a generic that's parameterized with the garage sale user class that we have already defined. Now, I need to do a couple of usings here, so let's do that real quick so that we get rid of some of these errors. So use your light bulb to add the using statement for garage sale user as well as the user manager, which is part of the identity namespace. I also need a password hasher because the passwords are not stored in plain text. They are stored as a strong hash. That is also available for us, and the data type is iPassword hasher. And again, we provide the user class as a generic parameter here. Now, these parameters are not just automatically injected like they would be with a constructor. We need to tell Framework where this is coming from. The attribute from services tells the injection service where this comes from. Both parameters are going to come from services. Now we have the tools we need to get started. Most of this is just regular old C# now. We're going to just create our garage sale user. We can use the new syntax for new where we can omit the class name because we don't need to do that anymore. And we can fill in the properties. We'll use the password hasher to set the user's password. Now we can create some items. So we're going to create a new list of items, and we're going to populate the list with multiple items that this user has for sale. Okay, now that we have that done, we are going to use the user manager to create this user. Because it's a create async, I want to wait for this to complete so that I'm sure that they got created before we return. So I'm just going to call the wait function and wait for this to complete before we go on and create the next user. Okay, now we're basically going to repeat this process to create a different user. So I'm going to create another user, Barney Rubble here. Boom. So with new user, I don't need to declare the variable again. I will set that user's items to some items that are for sale, and then we will create that user and wait for the result. If you want to see what the result actually was, you can declare a variable and grab that. Otherwise, we'll just call wait and wait for that to complete. Then we need to tell it what view to go to. So we'll return a redirect to action to say, let's go back to the index, the home page. After running this controller action, we should see some items show up because they will have been created in the database. Let's do a build and see if we have any errors. And looks like we're in good shape with that. Now, let's run it. Remember the name of our action method, CDB. All right, when we run our application, you'll notice our screen is blank because now we're pulling from the database and there's nothing in there. So let's just browse to our seed DB. So home is the controller name. Seed DB, it's not case sensitive, is the name of our method. If there were no errors or any problems, you'll get redirected back to the home page and there you'll see our items list. Hey, let's make some changes to the seller controller so that we can work with our database context. Our database context needs to know who the authenticated user is, and we'll do that by setting the user email property. Now, at this point, the user has logged in, so we can find out who that is. The problem is that the identity name has not been set, or the identity principal has not been set at the time that the controller's constructor executes. So we're going to have to use something called an accessor object, which is one of the objects that can be automatically injected. So I'm going to declare that object. It's an HTTP context accessor as one of my parameters. That will be injected. Now I can use that accessor object to access the HTTP context and access the user identity name and set that equal to our service email. Now, I use the null coalescing operators, the question mark dot and the double question mark, to avoid warnings about possible null references. We won't have a null reference because the user identity should have been set, but this satisfies the warning. If you want to know more about null coalescing operators, check out the lesson in the link above on null coalescing operators. Okay, now that we have our user email property set, we can replace all these hard-coded user emails. Let's try out the seller login button. So we get redirected to the login screen. One of our users is Fred at bedrock.com, and remember his password is bedrock20 exclamation point. Look at that to be sure, and then I'll hit login. and I am checking out Fred's homepage. We can hit edit, we can save, and things seem to be working like they're supposed to. Delete an item and it gets deleted. Well, there you go. A complete ASP.NET 6 MVC application complete with authentication and database. Check out that description below so that you can download the finished source code. There's a lot more that we can explore, so make sure you subscribe to our channel and check out our full courses on our website at www.mcculloughassociates.com. I'm Chuck McCullough. Have a great day.